Hi there, I'm Patrick McHugh with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, a project of the North Carolina Justice Center where we are dedicated to building a world where everyone, Black, brown, and white, can live economically secure and dignified lives. I sat down recently with Bob Korstad, who teaches public policy at Duke University. Bob has spent his life grappling with the past, documenting working people's stories and sifting through that rich inheritance for lessons about how we can move forward. A lot of Bob's work is focused on how economic and political elites stoke racial divisions to preserve their power. But he also brings to light incredible stories, too often forgotten, of working people fighting back against a rigged system. In trying to understand the current reality people face, we sat down towards the end of 2020 to talk about what inspiration we can draw from the history of worker struggles in the South, how our past shaped the COVID-19 crisis, and how we can build a more just society. We pick up the conversation as Bob reflects on the story of Local 22, one of the most remarkable chapters in North Carolina's history, and his father's experience working with the leaders of that effort. Please join us.
Local 22 of the Food and Tobacco Workers, which was one of their largest local unions. It had been created in 1943 by Black workers, mostly Black workers, some whites, at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, in a really kind of amazing sit-down strike and kind of an overnight mobilization of 9,000 Black workers that eventually won a union contract. The NLRB came in, and it was this really kind of militant Black-led union that attracted a tremendous amount of national and international attention, in part because of the dynamic role that Black women played in the union. There were a number of very articulate, very charismatic Black women leaders. One of those leaders was a woman named Miranda Smith, who'd grown up in South Carolina, a sharecropping family, had moved to Winston-Salem, was very, had a high school education, but really no opportunity to do anything other than work in the tobacco factories. And she really emerged as one of the more dynamic leaders. And soon after he got there, he really took on the responsibility of training her to take over his job. That was kind of one of the options. So he spent a year and a half or so traveling around the South with a Black woman. They would do all these exchanges where sometimes she'd sit in the front seat, sometimes she'd sit in the back seat, depending on what the mores of the particular community were, to keep them from being, attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. I think that was eye-opening for him. I don't think he'd ever really appreciated or understood the kind of violence of Jim Crow. He got a good handful of it in that experience. And then for a variety of reasons, the union lost its contract with the company in the McCarthy era and aftermath of the Taft-Hartley Act.
When you look at the chapter of history with Local 22, what sort of hopeful lessons do you take about what that chapter tells us in this moment of trial and tumult?
Yeah, I think the story of Local 22 in Winston-Salem is really pretty remarkable. This is a union that was created at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, also at a number of the independent leaf houses in Winston-Salem. They ultimately helped organize 10,000 mostly Black women in Eastern North Carolina in a separate local working in the leaf houses. Partly it was phenomenal because Reynolds was one of the most anti-union companies in the country, in the South. It was known as the Ford of the South. Ford being the most reluctant, the automobile company that was most anti-union, and Reynolds had that same reputation, and they had fought efforts by the American Federation of Labor to organize tobacco workers in Winston-Salem. They've been doing that since the turn of the 20th century. Tobacco workers have been organized for the most part in other places, in Durham and Louisville and Richmond. But Reynolds was very opposed to unions and very good at playing black and white workers off against each other. So when the AFL would come in and try to organize white workers, the company would, play the blacks off against them, where they might promote some blacks into white jobs, temporarily to let the white workers know that you may think, because of Jim Crow and segregation, that your jobs are secure and that these are white jobs, but these are our jobs, not your jobs, and we'll put in there whoever we want. And so they had been playing whites and blacks off against each other for years. The black workers they'd made efforts to work with white workers in the late 1930s. They'd made efforts on their own. And in the 1941-42, a few organizers from FTA came into the city, started meeting with a small group of people, but they never had, they had 20, or maybe they had 100 people signed up. Maybe they had 20 people who would come to meetings. And then one day in 1943, there was a sit-down strike in one of the stimmeries, led by black women, around working conditions, the death of a worker. And over 7 days, they had signed up 7,000 to 8,000 members. The women organizers were walking around. They paid everybody in silver dollars. They called them bow dollars. And they were walking around with their aprons with hundreds and hundreds of dollars, these silver dollars, just dragging them down. And they were able to beat back the anti-union efforts of the company, which also included trying to mobilize the black middle class in Winston-Salem in opposition to the union. Finally got a contract that improved wages, working conditions, all kind of a lot of different things. What was, I think, remarkable about it is that nobody could have predicted that those workers could have ever done something like that. They didn't even think they could do something like that. And it wasn't like this was just a spontaneous strike where something just set everybody off. I mean, this was a strike that required a lot of different a strike and organizing effort that required a lot of different elements, including kind of a long period of social learning in which black leaders had understood the way they were being played off against whites, and a small number of white people understood that and were willing to join the union. It took an interesting cadre of worker leaders, many of whom were kind of leaders in their own communities, in their churches, and on their sports teams, in civic clubs. A number of the women in particular had high school and some college education, and for them, the jobs open to them were very limited. So there were a lot of things that came together, and that was part of my book, Civil Rights Unionism, was trying to really understand that. But it's one of those experiences that, I compare it a lot to the kind of fall of apartheid in South Africa. When things start to happen and social change happens, it can happen really overnight, but it requires a lot of stuff to have happened before that, a lot of things to happen, a lot of mobilizations, a lot of losses. And so, one of the lessons of Local 22 for me today is that, as organizers and as people thinking about social change, there's a lot of things that you have to have in your mind, be thinking about the role of culture, the role of, of gender, the way, the leadership styles that different people have, the experiences that people have that make them more or less prone to taking leadership roles or supporting your organization. So it makes you realize it's not just a matter of going out and knocking on doors and getting people to sign up. It's actually, the process of movement building is actually quite sophisticated. There's similarities in the past. I mean, this whole issue of network and communication. Well, in Winston-Salem in 1943, they didn't have social media. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have cell phones, but they had all kinds of ways that the networks were intricate in the ways that people got messages and knowledge to each other. In terms of the 1943 strike, the day after the initial sit down, the way the word got out was these Black women who were only a couple hundred strong went back into their neighborhoods and communities, and as they walked home, they talked to other women who were sitting on their front porches after a hard day of work, and the word about this spread very quickly in this very densely populated area. So they didn't need cell phones. They had their voices. They had a porch culture. They had links within their churches, within extended families. So in a way, we've got all these new technologies and new techniques and stuff, but some of the basics are the same that they have been for a long period of time.
You're touching on, unfortunately, sad reality that so often is the case, that when you see social progress and you see particularly folks that have the least power and the least wealth start to gain some influence, to organize effectively, to move the conversation in the right direction, that the forces of retrenchment are usually not that far behind to try to push back on them. And it wasn't Donald Trump coming down the escalator talking about Mexicans was not the first time that we'd seen racism very explicitly used to push back on a moment of progress. Mm. And so I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about how race has been used as a tool, not just to stymie social progress, but to maintain a status quo that benefits a very small elite economically and politically in North Carolina and in the South. It's not quite as bold-faced these days as it used to be, but there's a trajectory there into our history of how race has been used to maintain political and economic power in a very small number of hands.
Yeah, the history of the way that race and racism has been used by elites to maintain power and create divisions within society really is as old as this country. I mean, older than the country. If you go back and look at the kind of Virginia in the colonial period, and this is work that I learned a lot from both in graduate school and later by Edmund Morgan and a historian at Columbia now, Barbara Fields, and her sister Karen Fields. Just the way that the whole concept of race gets created in the early colonial period as a way of trying to play poor whites who had been indentured servants, taking the case of Virginia in particular, who start, building alliances with Africans, some of whom are free, some of whom are enslaved, and as these indentured servants are gaining their freedom and they're kind of demanding, both land and a kind of place in this so-called democracy, it becomes very difficult for elites to figure out how to keep that under control. And one of the things that Evan Morgan really talks about is how the enslavement of Africans goes hand in hand with the concepts of freedom for whites. That you can be your freedom, if you're white, your freedom depends on the enslavement or the non-freedom of blacks. And so in a way it's foundational to our society, and in the United States generally, but particularly in the South. And that story has played out over time. I mean, it's still there. It's still an argument that people use as a way of trying to create divisions between blacks and whites who, on the surface have all the same kind of have a lot of the same kinds of needs, whether it's in terms of healthcare or good jobs or environmental protections or housing or whatever. But as long as you can keep whites thinking that their white skin gives them a little bit more privilege or a little more security than it does black people, maybe that's something that'll keep them apart. And that's certainly things that, if you look back at the history of North Carolina, particularly after the Civil War, and in our book, Fragile Democracy, one of the things we're looking at is this kind of these cycles of what we call emancipatory politics and conservative retrenchments, in which coalitions of blacks and whites are formed. They're very tenuous. I mean, the kind of the animosities, the distrust that's there, that's kind of built into the system, never entirely goes away. But they're able at times to forge those coalitions. Happens right after the Civil War. And then white elites are able to come in and both use violence, but also just the threats towards whites that you're going to lose some of your status if you continue to cooperate with blacks. And that's played out in kind of over time in North Carolina, time and time again. As sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think in North Carolina, it's worked enough so that, for long periods of time, those kinds of divisions were able to create enough power for elites to be able to withstand the kind of the efforts of people to challenge both the political status, but also the social status.
For all that, for a while, particularly in North Carolina, you had a Democratic Party that was drawing from diverse constituencies, at least. But if you looked at the leadership of the party, it didn't look terribly like the folks that were supporting it, right? Or at least in the proportions of, the breakdown was not the same. And there is, I think, still a hesitancy to speak directly to the role of race in dividing working people against each other. When we get into the political sphere. And I'm curious whether you see that changing in this moment, where we've sort of acknowledged, some folks have acknowledged implicitly or tacitly that race is always there and has never left the conversation and is still very much a weapon that's used to divide people. But for a long time, even on the sort of nominally progressive circles, there was a resistance to actually talk about it. And I'm curious whether you see any of that changing in this moment.
The way in which race and kind of racism enters into the political battles today is, has a lot of similarities in the past. I mean, if you look at some of the political advertisements, some of the things that are coming out of politicians' mouth, particularly conservative politicians these days, they don't sound that different from Jesse Helms, or they don't sound that different from Strom Thurmond, or other kind of white supremacists of the late 19th, early 20th century, blaming blacks for their own, for the economic inequality, saying, characterizing, black life in these very derogatory ways. So I think that is that element of it is still there, and we see that all the time. And I think that there's still a significant portion of white Americans who kind of harbor, I think, racial and ethnic resentment towards African Americans, but also towards new immigrants, particularly immigrants from Central and South Mexico, Central and South America, who they have. If you look at the decline of opportunity and prosperity for kind of the white working class, lower middle class and white working class in this country in the last, say, 30 to 40 years, brought on by a whole series of factors: trade policies, deindustrialization, automation, kind of a loss of a social safety net. I mean, there's a lot of there are a lot of reasons why lower income white people should be very apprehensive, very frightened. The issue is who they should be frightened of, and what should they be frightened of. And it's always, it's much more complicated to come up with an argument that blames, bankers and corporations and trade advocates and other people for your situation and the challenge facing you, than it is just to blame somebody who looks a little different like you. And you've got some politician who's standing up there saying, well, this is this is the fault of these Mexicans. They're coming in to take your jobs. These people want us, they're stealing from you, or they're sexual predators, or, we can just blame all your problems on all these people. That's a lot easier to do than try to figure out. And, I think that that still has a place for people. And there's a lot, the kind of attitudes that people have and the experiences that whites, let's just take about in the South, have around issues of race are deep-seated, generational kind of experiences, even among poor whites, where, if people don't live together, go to school, go to church together, it's very hard to build those alliances and build those kinds of understandings. And that's one of the real, I think, was one of the real goals and one of the real successes, if you want to say that, of kind of Jim Crow and segregation. If you could, and one of the real reasons for, I think, the kind of segregation laws that we see, whether it's keeping people apart in schools or not having them in neighborhoods, and you didn't live together, you didn't go to church together, you didn't socialize together, you didn't do cultural events together. If you don't have the experiences that build those kinds of relationships and understandings and the kind of commonalities, it's very easy to kind of fall back on these stereotypes of blaming something else, particularly when it's just being driven into you all the time. And I think that there's a lot of that going there. There's a lot of that in the country today. So.
Well, Bob, I really appreciate the opportunity to get to sit with you and try to process a little bit of what we're going through in this moment, and some of the long history that got us here, that hopefully also points a way forward for how we can use this moment make some positive change in this country. You know, what it's going to take to organize together and to build power internally and in fellowship with other folks, and how we can acknowledge sort of the role of race in perpetuating a system that really works to, you know, do most people wrong one way or another. So I really appreciate, again, the time to sit with you and chat and benefit from the amount of time you've spent contemplating North Carolina's history and how we got here.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, I think that, you know, I mean, I think this is a moment where we need to be doing a lot of kind of thinking and reflecting and reckoning and, you know, about why we're in the situation we're in. You know, we need to be doing a lot of deep questioning right now. And I don't think that, you know, we're not going to go forward in a very positive way if we don't do that, because I don't think just a lot of little quick solutions, oh, we'll do this, we'll make this change, we'll make that change, you know, in whatever realm of public policy it is, I don't think it's going to be sufficient or sustainable if we don't ask the kind of questions and do the kind of deep analysis that we need to do. And